So then now we move to, well, more in depth to what happens in the Kovacova project together with Armanda, Cetrulo, and Lucia Kovacova. Lucia and Armanda together worked on, well, different reports already, and they can show a bit of insights. So the floor is to Armanda and Lucia. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can hear me clearly and you can see the presentation in full screen mode. So my name is Lucia Kovacova. I work for CELSI as a researcher, and together with my colleague Armanda, we will present to you methodology and some part of preliminary findings of our data mining analysis, which is of course part of the Kovacova project. And in our presentation, we will focus and we'll clarify our methodology and analytical framework. We will clarify how we use the data mining methods, text analysis methods, and what was the aim of the research. And we will also present some of our preliminary findings and our future plans, since, as you know, the research is still in progress. In this part of the Kovacova project, we answer the first research question about the effects of the pandemic on the industrial relations landscape, mainly in terms of actually how the public discourse has been shaped in relation to policy measures or policy responses to the pandemic, how this discourse evolved and changed over time, or especially during the first and the second year of the pandemic, and how this discourse differ from country to country. And to meet these aims, as I mentioned, we use the data mining and text analysis techniques. So based on the selected keywords, we extracted text data from social partners, newsletters, from websites, and from publicly available sources, and analyze them using both quantitative analysis and qualitative methods, also to examine not only some kind of trends and figures, but also to grasp more contextual information about this policy discourse. And as you can see, we use newsletter sources from both national level social partners, so national languages, as well as EU level organizations that deal with social dialogue in Europe, but also in candidate countries, because these countries we covered in our research. And the keywords that we used for data mining and analysis were related to key themes, such as labor market policies, like different kind of labor market policies, industrial relations, also pandemic related themes. So we had about a list of, I guess, 80 keywords that we used, and we translated the national languages, and this is how we proceeded. When it comes to analysis, so far we conducted rather descriptive analysis of the whole sample, in which we focused on the frequency of policies in the newsletter outputs to explore how the discourse has been shaped. And we also did comparative analysis of 2 pandemic years to see how the policy discussion evolved, what the variations are between the first and the second year of pandemic. And besides that, we also did a comparative analysis based on the welfare regimes classification or typology, when we clustered countries in our sample into welfare regime models or types, and analyzed also variation between countries in relation to the policies that were present in this policy or public discourse among social partners. And we focused on, in this part of analysis, we focused on 6 types of policies, particularly job retention schemes, loans, remote work, caregiver support, a measure for non-standard workers, mainly self-employed people, and protection of workers, mainly in terms of health and safety measures. And besides that, we also did a qualitative text analysis of the selected newsletters by using Deduce software, as I mentioned, to grasp more contextual information, qualitative information about the policy discussion. So this is a figure about the structure of the database. This figure was already presented by Hido, and it shows distribution of text data by country. This is a sample that we have right now. And as you can see, some countries were underrepresented or are underrepresented, which is given also by the availability of data. But I would like to highlight that we are still in the phase of data collection, so we will continue with this task, and we are working on strengthening the representativeness, as this is clearly one of the limits of our research, but research is not over, and this will be one of our future goals to strengthen and to focus on representativeness. Now I will shortly present you some preliminary findings of our analysis. I will start with a comparison analysis of the frequency of keywords between 2 pandemic years. Just one methodological note that I forgot to mention is that we did not use the pandemic waves, but we use years, because pandemic waves, they occurred in different time periods across EU and candidate countries, so the data won't be comparable in this respect. That's why we used pandemic years and not waves, because it would be hard to compare data using these reference times. So we compared the occurrence of policy-related words, and as you can see in this figure, keywords such as loans, short-time work schemes, remote work or telework presented the most frequent policies in the discourse of social partners based on the newsletters and analysis during the first 2 years of the pandemic, so during the whole period of time. But at the same time, we can also observe differences between 2 pandemic years when, for example, keywords such as loan and short-time work scheme were dominant in the discussion in the first pandemic year, mainly in the context of the first policy responses to the crisis, and they presented a state support to preserve jobs and prevent layoffs. And in the second year, you can see that short-time work schemes continue to be very integral part of the policy discussion, but also other issues or other policies or themes became more present in the discourse, such as remote work, telework, which is also related to the fact that there were different regulations in place over teleworking, and it became prevalent in the discussion among social partners. And we can see also other examples. I don't think that we have enough time to go into detail and to present other findings, but it's necessary to treat these findings as preliminary, since after we will enlarge the sample and strengthen representativeness, especially in terms of countries and structure of countries in the sample. We will replicate this analysis, and we will be working on this in the second or in the following phases of the project. And now I will give the floor to Armanda, who will present again preliminary findings of our comparative analysis based on welfare regimes classification when we clustered countries into welfare regimes, which enable us to analyze group of countries based on some similarities in social programs and other policy measures related to the commodification of labor. So now I will give the floor to Armanda. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for this clear and rich presentation. Yes, we now move to the last part of our presentation that concern the preliminary results that exactly were coming from the analysis accounting for from clustering countries. So essentially what we thought that it could be interesting to see if the way social actors were phrasing their discourse on pandemic was different across not simply countries, but let's say institutional clusters, welfare regimes, and also position in the European Union. That's why we adopted the classification of welfare regimes that Lucia just showed you. And what we see here, you see that we don't have country anymore, but we have cluster groups of welfare regime. We try to see if the language change, if the relevance of the 6 policies on which we focus our analysis was different across the countries. And what it emerges, this is made on all the period, so in the 2 years, what it emerged is that, as you can see, the most discussed topics, the most discussed policies in all the countries, in all the groups of countries, are job retention schemes and remote work and telework. But on the other hand, we find some interesting differences across groups of countries, in particular for what concern caregiver support, as you see, is the red bar. You see that is very residual in the case of Mediterranean and Central Eastern Europe, whereas is more discussed in social democratic regimes. The same happens to protection of workers, where instead we see that Mediterranean countries and liberal regimes show a higher frequency of these policies within the entire discourse, the entire database. Loans, that is the gray bar, is not very discussed, and this is also reasonable because loans concern all the measures that were taken to support firms. So it might be that was not one of the main concerns of social actors, trade unions in their newsletters. So Lucia, you can move to the next slide, where simply we sum up this very preliminary but indeed interesting result, where we have the impression that looking at clusters of countries might be an interesting key of analysis in order to underline the differences of convergences across countries. And in order to do so, we also have to complement our quantitative analysis on the frequency of words and policies to a more qualitative analysis. For instance, as I showed you before, we saw that there are job retention schemes are one of the topics and policies most discussed in all the countries. But if we look inside the newsletters, for instance, we observe interesting convergence and similarity between within the Central European countries, where short-time work scheme following the German Kurzarbeit model are discussed. So this is why also the qualitative analysis is important, because it's a way to characterize what we find only in terms of frequency and quantitative occurrence in our text. Then another novelty that is interesting, not only in the social discourse, but as we know in the policies that have been taken during the pandemic, has been the introduction of specific schemes, specific policies for non-standard workers. And this is actually one, let's say, another important topic that we will further deep in, trying to understand which type of measures were adopted in different countries and how this was perceived by the social actors. You can move to the next slide. Then the last preliminary finding that I want to share, we would like to share with you, concern the evolution over time. As Lucia said, we decided to split the database into, taking into account the 2 years in order to see which change, if there were some changes in the public discourse, in the social discourse. Here you see we have figures for each country, and we have the frequency of each topic in each year. So looking at the difference of the two bars for each policy, we can understand if that topic was discussed more or less in the first compared to the second year. So what we see, you can move to the next slide, is that interestingly, we see that the job retention schemes were discussed more in the first year. This is also someone that Lucia was stressing before. And in all countries, we see that their frequency is reducing, is going down. On the other hand, we see that there is an increase in discussion on remote work and telework, because we know that in the 2021, several countries were also adopting a specific regulation for remote workers. There were also experience of social pacts, agreement across social actors. So this became a topic discussed more than before. But concerning, for instance, caregiver support, we see that it is decreasing, its frequency is decreasing over time in all the countries except social democratic regimes. And this is, let's say, critical point, according to us, that may be discussed also on more general terms in terms of policies, because we know that the pandemic has also been a crisis of care, but at least from our very preliminary findings, it looks like that this topic was not really addressed even by the social actors. And I think that this is more or less what I wanted to highlight with respect to this result. So future steps. As Lucia already said, one very important issue concerns the representativeness of the database. This research question, this research project has a novelty, according to us, that is using and exploiting the information coming from newsletters. This is really something new that we are trying to explore, because we believe there is a source of information that trade unions and social actors actually use to discuss and to talk with their members. So it's something from which we think we can grasp interesting information on how also they build their narrative resources in terms of hegemony, in terms of consensus, and so on. So of course this is interesting, but has some feedback, some weaknesses. The most important one is the availability of the data of the newsletters. So we are working and we are willing to increase the size of the database and increase the representativeness according to criteria that can make our analysis more robust. And then of course there is the exploitation of the text and the analysis to perform further quantitative and qualitative analysis, as Lucia was already saying. And for instance, one interesting thing that we would like to do is to investigate the semantic similarities of texts and newsletters across countries, to see if different type of clusters can actually emerge from our analysis. And then there is of course a complementary project that has been presented before by Ido, that is the survey on renewal strategies that we will also launch in the fall of this year. So this is an additional source of information for us, because looking at how social actors were really addressing the issue of renewal, and now we have a panel with people that were protagonists in this specific stage of the process. So this will allow also us to have a different piece of analysis, and not only look at the social discourse, but also see in practical terms how then changes and policies took place in terms of collective agreements. So I think I can conclude here, and thank you everyone. Thanks all the people for listening to our presentation. If you want, you can already download freely the reports, the first 3 reports that are available on the website of the project. And as already Ido said, we will soon publish also the next report, where you will find this information with more details and more descriptions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Armanda. Lucia, well done.